The Rampart corruption scandal.
Oh no!
A dark mark on the LAPD's otherwise spotless history.
Spotless because they bleached over it.
It's just all spot. There's no... You can't tell anymore. Is the zebra white with black stripes? That wasn't a racial comment. Shut up.
I felt very uncomfortable for a minute.
I felt uncomfortable also. I should have talked about like a lion or something.
They're from Africa.
This whole episode, not this episode, but the Rampart corruption episode, it'll go down as the worst scandal in LAPD history. Mm-hmm. This story has a lot of ties in people's minds with the movie Training Day.
I've never seen that. What's it about?
It's about the Rampart corruption scandal. It's exactly the same thing.
You just said that. Okay.
It's a documentary. In reality, Training Day was written years before this story came to light.
Oh, really?
It actually started being made a little after the peak of the whole thing, so parts of the movie were probably rewritten to try to reflect it a little better. Denzel Washington made himself look more like the central figure of this scandal for the filming, and according to IMDb...
Oh boy, the most credible source I could think of on the internet.
His character's license plate number, ORP967, is a reference to the man at the center of this real-life story, Officer Rafael Perez, born 1967.
Ah, clever.
Actually born in the year 967. As a side note, James Ellroy apparently called Training Day a complete waste of time. Fortunately for Ellroy, the true story of what happened is not as clear-cut as the movie and is much more confusing, if you can believe that. To start, if you would let me, let's set the stage of what the city was like at the time. Gangs? Is that how it's pronounced? Gangs?
Yeah.
A gangster is a member of a gang, correct?
Yeah, they're one unit of a gang.
A gangster of gang members makes a gang.
Yeah, exactly.
So they've been around in LA forever, but in the late 70s, 1970s, Greg,
disco.
when the comedy... What did I say?
Comedy?
You said disco, and my mind started doing the funk. When the economy was not so good, things were starting to get noticeably bad. Most of the serious gangs up to this point had been Latino, mostly Mexican, but around this time there was a big influx of immigrants from Central and South America, wherein a lot of places you couldn't trust the police, so some people decided to take matters into their own hands, and a lot of new Latino gangs started popping up. In addition, the black gangs were starting to emerge as a serious force of crime at the same time. In 1979, there were 2,088 major crimes in the city. By 1981, there were 5,158.
Oh my God.
To try to keep up the LAPD with the help of a federal grant. In 1977, they formed a special unit based out of the Hollenbeck station, made up of 44 officers that would focus exclusively on areas where gang activity was high. This unit was called Total Resources Against Street Hoodlums, aka Trash. By 1979, the city took over funding this unit, and they changed the word total to community because it was so offensive, and it was now called Crash.
Yeah.
And it's also confusing because there's Training Day, which is kind of not really about this, and then there's the movie Rampart, which is not really about this, and then there's two movies called Crash, which are kind of dealing with the same thing but have nothing to do with it. Well, one of them is kind of dealing with the same thing.
Yeah, the other one's
the other one's hot.
Oh boy, I'm getting all spicy.
Yeah, I want to go drive my car
into a wall.
The county sheriff's department formed a similar task force in 1978 called Operation Safe Streets that has been called by many as being way more effective than Crash. So where the OSS had a strategy of target gang suppression where they would focus only on the gangs causing the most trouble, Crash was using total gang suppression, which meant they were focusing on all gangs at all times. They were less focused, not quite as effective, and not quite as gentle either. Crash officers were assigned to a gang, and it was their job to find out everything about that gang. So their history, who their enemies were, who was in the gang, what their nicknames were, who they were dating, where their mom lived, whether Greg was affiliated. They would know everyone in that gang intimately, but they wouldn't just spy on them from afar as Greg does.
I want to know what they're doing. What's that handball game? I want to play.
They would actually interact with them daily. It wasn't always the sort of relationship that you would think. Some of the relationships were strangely pleasant.
I've heard such thing. I've heard that they come and introduce themselves, and it's kind of on friendly terms until something goes wrong. Yeah. But they kind of stopped it. From what I hear, will stop in when nothing's going wrong, just checking up on them and just it's like a formal introduction between enemies.
Oh, Mr. Cop Lover here. Oink, oink. I guess someone's having a luau.
I'm neutral.
Yeah, they would talk about their families and their loved ones. Part of this was just out of human kindness, but part of it was also that some of the gang members wanted to have just as much detailed information about the officers as they had on them. A lot of these relationships, they could go sour in an instant. So like a guy you were talking to one day could be having a bad day the next, and turn around, you call his name, and he turns around and shoots at you. The officers joining CRASH were some of the best in the LAPD, Greg. It appealed to many because in CRASH, you weren't stuck at a desk and you didn't have to deal with like trivial day-to-day cop stuff like car crashes, domestic abuse, the usual.
Supposedly Sunday is domestic abuse day. I've heard a cop say that before.
Is that official? Is that like a federal holiday?
Well, when I was working as a cashier across the street from a police station, it was Sunday, and I said, "How's your Sunday going, officer?" He's like, "Sunday's the worst day because it's domestic. Because like Saturday nights, the guys are drinking and they beat their wives. Sunday,
they go to church the next day, feel guilty, and
listen, God, I'm sorry. I won't apologize to her, but I'm sorry."
The CRASH officers, they had to be tough to not be afraid of gangsters, and as a result, in order to fight violent gangsters, some of these cops had to be just as violent, and because of that, CRASH was sometimes criticized as being a gang itself. The specific unit that we're going to be talking about is the Rampart CRASH unit.
Oh boy.
Every area of the city has a name given to it by the LAPD. Rampart is the area bordered by Sunset on the north, Normandy on the west, the 110 on the east, and the 10 on the south. Where do you live?
What division covers me?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's northeast. I don't know. I live in Echo Park. I don't know who covers me. I think it's northeast. I live really close to the police academy. I think the cadets.
You're the like test ground. So the Rampart covers 7.9 square miles and is made up of Angelino Heights, Echo Park, not your part of Echo Park.
Oh yeah, the bad side by the lake.
Yeah. Filipino Town, Koreatown, Lafayette Park, MacArthur Park, Pico Union, Temple Beaudry, Virgil Village, and Westlake. That's what's covered in there.
Some scary areas there.
What's scary about MacArthur Park?
What's scary about Lafayette Park?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Okay, let's go there right now. I'm not afraid.
I'm not afraid of anything.
No, me either. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to flash some signs. I don't care what's going to happen. I'm scared. At the time,
let's both shave our heads.
Hey guys, we're not afraid of you.
How about some of that handball? I know it's really late.
You keep bringing up handball. Do they really play handball a lot?
When I was a kid, I used to see a lot of handball with the really small rubber balls.
Small ones.
Yeah, and I used to play baseball with them because if you hit them, they go really far, and you think that you're Ken Griffey Jr. You're not.
I hate to break it to you, Sonny. You're playing stickball.
I played stickball? Really?
You used a stick, didn't you? So at the time of the scandal, the late 90s, it was the most densely populated area west of the Mississippi with 36 I turned too much into Mark Twain. With 36,000 people per square mile and even more living undocumented. Also at the time, there were over 60 active gangs in Rampart with around 8,000 members. That's a lot of stickball, Greg. So because of that, Rampart led LA in murder, drug sales, and violent crime. Isn't that great?
Hey, we had to be a leader of something.
You can't have one without the other two. To fight all this, the Rampart CRASH unit had around a dozen officers on average. 20, it would fluctuate. 20 was the highest number they would have during the summer when gang activity was the highest.
Yeah.
So having to deal with these numbers, the Rampart CRASH unit had developed a sort of brotherhood mentality to keep themselves strong against what they were facing. It was referred to as the Rampart Way.
Oh, I don't appreciate your tone.
It's in quotations, Greg.
Oh boy. You are. You're just quoting the tone.
They had their own logo that officers would put on their clothing or even get tattooed onto themselves, onto their skin, Greg.
Like a gang.
No, it's not like that. You see, they're on the city payroll. They're not a gang.
The city paid for their tattoos.
Their logo was called the Aces and Eights, and it showed a skull wearing a cowboy hat. Scary? Are you scared yet?
How hillbilly.
There's more. The skull, there were 4 playing cards, sort of around the where the neck would be. There were 4 playing cards, 2 aces and 2 eights. This is known as the dead man's hand because it's the poker hand that Wild Bill Hickok was holding when he was killed. So it was partly because of this that they were referred to as the cowboy cops. Gangsters feared this logo. They also had a reward system where if you shot a gangster in the line of duty, you got a special plaque.
Oh,
so
man.
If the guy you shot died, the plaque had a card with a black number 2 on it. If it lived, it was a red number 2. There were also shell casings on them for how many times you shot the person.
Is this a video game they played?
Yeah, it's called We're Cops and We're Discriminatory. 64.
My mom will not buy that for me.
It's not that great. It's not as good as the first one.
Which was a paddy wagon and a baton.
Rampart Crash became more and more of an autonomous entity from the rest of the LAPD. While other crash officers had to wear full uniform, Rampart Crash insisted on wearing street clothes.
Oh boy.
In 1995, the Rampart police station was getting too crowded, so Rampart Crash got their own headquarters at 3rd and Union, and they became even more their own separate organization. Their motto, written above the door, was, "We intimidate those who intimidate others."
But we also intimidate those too.
We intimidate all.
Oh, exactly.
When you're leaving on the other side of the door. Don't forget to intimidate. Now, when all LAPD officers join the force, they get what's called a 999 key that gives them access to all the police stations in the city. When Rampart Crash got their building, they changed the locks on the parking area to only accept a special 888 key that only Rampart Crash officers had. The center of the scandal, like I said, was a man named Rafael Perez. He was born in Puerto Rico, 1967. Just like the license plate. Just like Denzel's license plate. Oh, I love that movie.
Raining Day? What was it?
Yeah, Rain Man Day.
Rain Man Day.
But he came to the U.S. at a young age, first to New Jersey, then to Philadelphia, where he would regularly witness drug deals on the street and dream of being able to stop them, just like his LAPD heroes on the hit show Adam 12. In 1985, Perez graduated high school, joined the Marines. After his service, he eventually joined the LAPD at age 21 in June of 1989. He served his rookie year doing the regular cop sort of stuff, but he soon joined up with the West Side Narcotics Bureau, where he was taken under the wing of a man named David Mack. Remember all these names. You might want to have a notepad.
All right, I'm gonna write down David Mack. Who else should I write down?
Denzel Washington was there, Wild Bill Hickok was there, and Ethan Hawke. Wild Bill, Ethan Hickok.
To the mortuary.
He was a vampire. Pay attention to all these names because it's all they're all going to be coming back.
I wrote down David Mack.
David Mack. Who's that? I'll tell you who's that. He was a former track and field star who almost married Florence Joyner, who was an Olympic gold medalist, a track and field star also. Mack was the best in the narcotics unit and had very sharp street smarts, which amazed Perez, so he started idolizing and copying Mack in every way. At one point, their friendship was solidified when supposedly Mack saved Perez's life in a sting operation that went bad. Someone like drew a gun. I don't know how... Look, I don't know what happens on the street.
What do I look like, a dragnet to you?
Perez himself, who went by Ray on the force, was very good at the job as well. He spoke Spanish, which was very helpful. So in 1995, Mack used his connections in the force to get Perez sponsored into Rampart Crash because he had to be sponsored in by an old partner of Mack's named Sammy Martin. That's another name you're going to want to remember.
Sammy Martin.
This is great. If you have little kids that are trying to learn how to spell and read, listen to this. You should. Yeah. This will really teach you.
It'll teach some great hand-eye coordination, what cops to be afraid of.
Anyone named Mack, Martin, Washington, Hawk. Mack is also the godfather to Martin's son.
I always put Godfather.
Write down Godfather, everybody. So all the pieces are now on the board. So I'm going to tell you 3 separate incidents that happened as they were officially reported.
Okay.
Incident 1, March 18th, 1997, Ventura Boulevard, Studio City. Fade in. Adam 12. Calling all cars. Calling all cars. We've got police brutality. Here's a new name for you. Officer Frank Liga was working undercover as a member of the Aryan Brotherhood and was stopped at a light.
What?
You heard me.
The AB?
The AB Society. He was stopped at a light when an SUV playing very loud hip-hop music pulled up next to him. The guy driving it kept staring at him, so Liga asked him if there was a problem, and the guy in the SUV went on to threaten him and told him he would put a cap inside of his ass.
Like a baseball cap?
Liga yelled back at him, and they both agreed to pull over and have it out. So they both pulled over, but when the guy in the SUV got out, Liga then pulled away back into traffic laughing at the guy. Guy in the SUV does not like that. Yeah. He started following Liga through the traffic until he finally pulled up next to him again, pulled out a gun on him. Liga managed to duck down, fire back, and he killed the guy.
He killed the guy in the SUV?
He killed the guy in the SVU.
Then they should solve the crime.
As it turns out, the guy in the SUV was a man named, here's a new name, Kevin Gaines, who is an off-duty cop.
Oh, no.
As it turns out, Gaines had a history of road rage and of threatening drivers before. 1994. Since Liga was white and Gaines was black, the incident became seen as a racial thing, which the LAPD took very seriously since they were recovering from Rodney King and the whole OJ thing that just happened. What it really was, though, was just two cops acting like macho idiots. Gaines's family sued the city for $25 million and had a one Johnny Cochran as their lawyer. Even though Liga was right, by all accounts, Liga was right in doing this, the city settled for $250,000 to give to Gaines's family just to not make it a big thing.
You always side with the Aryan Brotherhood.
What can I do? How am I going to get out of it?
So Liga won the case?
No,
Gaines won the case.
The city paid off. Correct. Come on.
I was
What are you, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood? Come on. The city paid off the Gaines family $250,000 just because they don't want another controversy like the whole Rodney King thing. The second incident. November 6, 1997. A Bank of America is robbed on Jefferson Boulevard across from USC. The robbers were led to the vault by the assistant manager, here's a name, Erlen Romero, and they made off with $722,000. That's the second incident. Pretty clear cut, I'd say.
All wrapped up, buddy.
With a bow.
I put Errol Flynn.
The third incident involves Perez himself. In 1996, Perez and the crash officer he had sponsored in himself, here's a new name, Nino Durden. He's from the man at Bleak Blork. They were staking out gang activity from an apartment Rampart CRASH rented out just for this purpose to sort of stake things out. When a guy named, I don't hear scratching on paper, Javier Francisco Ovando burst in with the intention of assassinating the two cops, but Perez and Durden managed to get the drop on him, if you will. Before he could, he was shot in the neck and the chest. His body was mostly paralyzed obviously for the rest of his life. That's not funny. It turned out Ovando was in the 18th Street gang and did not speak much English, but denied that he had tried to kill the two officers. The court didn't believe him. He was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Now is when the official versions of the stories start to fall apart. Let's revisit them, shall we?
Go back to one.
Let's go back to the first incident. You're correct. You are correct.
I know how numbers work.
The road rage one, in case you've forgotten. Like I said, Gaines, the off-duty officer who got killed, had a history of threatening to cap motorists. He also had a history of beating his wife, probably on Sunday, and fighting with other cops. He one time made a fake 911 call for cops to show up at a house just so he could pick a fight with them and then sue them.
Wow.
Yeah, this is when it starts getting really weird. The house he told them to show up at, the house of Sharitha Knight, Snoop Dogg's manager / Suge Knight's ex-wife. Suge Knight, in case you didn't know, is a co-founder of Death Row Records, but we all know that, am I right? As it turns out, Gaines was living in the mansion with Sharitha and living high with her money. What's so strange about that? A lot. Suge Knight was in prison at the time. And also a known gangster. He was a member of the Bloods. Turns out, so was Gaines. He was a member of the Bloods.
The off-duty cop.
The off-duty cop was also a Blood. He was seen regularly at Monty's Steakhouse in Westwood, which was at 1100 Glendon Avenue, which was a favorite death row hangout, and further investigation showed that Gaines was actually moving drugs and money for Suge while he was in prison. So Rampart CRASH and the LAPD in general, it's not as uncommon as you think. There were a lot of ties to Death Row Records. A lot of officers would work security for them when they were off duty to earn extra money.
Wow.
It was all incredibly suspicious, but the LAPD chose not to investigate it further after the road rage incident because Gaines was now dead, so the case is closed. Why should we look deeper into it? Now, let's go on to the second incident.
The bank robbery.
The bank robbery. Bank of America robbery. Bank
of America?
Getting robbed by USC. $722,000 stolen with assistant manager Errol Flynn, Erlen Romero on duty. Turns out Romero had ordered an unusually large amount of money to be brought to the bank that had just arrived 10 minutes before the robbery took place.
Oh, weird.
Also turns out she had a boyfriend. That's nice. Good for her.
Good for her. I'm glad she found somebody.
You know what his name was?
What was it?
David Mack.
Oh, really?
Perez's old partner, the former track and field star turned super narc that Perez idolized.
Super narc.
Mack also had a wife and kids away from his assistant manager girlfriend and had a love of going to clubs and gambling, which got him into a lot of credit card debt, and he was in need of quick cash. 2 days after the robbery, Mack, this isn't suspicious, took a lavish trip to Las Vegas.
Okay.
You know who he went with? His old friend Sammy Martin, the guy who sponsored Perez into CRASH, and who else? Rafael Perez.
Wow.
When Mack got back, he pulled Menendez brothers. He continued to spend lavishly. He bought a bunch of brand new leather furniture.
Oh, tacky.
I'm sure he got some watches.
And watched a James Bond film, why not?
Yeah. Meanwhile, his girlfriend Romero was a prime suspect in the case, and after a month of police pressure, she finally confessed and she ratted out Mack. Further investigation of Mack showed he was a member of the Bloods as well, and he was a friend of Gaines, and he was working for Suge Knight also. Mack is also believed to have been directly involved in the shooting of Notorious B.I.G. It may have been his car that Biggie was shot from, but none of this has been able to be proven.
Suge Knight was that generation's Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes had everyone assassinated. Howard Hughes killed Tupac.
Or was it Howard Hawks? I always get them confused. I think it was Howard Hughes.
I think you're thinking of Ethan Hawks.
Are they related?
Yeah. So on March 17th, 1999, Mack was sentenced to 14 years in prison for the robbery. He refused to name any other names, and while in prison, he slowly started wearing only red things and fully embraced the blood lifestyle and renounced his past with the LAPD. He was later shanked when his fellow inmates saw him on TV that he had been associated with Rafael Perez, who they all had grudges against.
Yeah.
The stolen money has never been recovered. Now, 2 of these good friends have had their ugly secrets exposed and have been punished for them. What about the third friend of theirs, Rafael Perez? He seemed to be skating by scot-free, and then he screwed up. March 27th, 1998, 6 pounds of cocaine are checked out from the evidence lockup and then go missing. They were checked out under the name of Joel Perez, who was a real member of the LAPD, but his signature was wrong.
Yeah.
Luckily, one of the clerks in the evidence lockup remembered the face of the man who had checked it out because he had been so memorably rude to her. That man was another Perez, Rafael Perez.
Oh boy.
That May, a secret Rampart corruption task force was formed to investigate what was really going on at Rampart CRASH, in particular what Rafael Perez was doing. At first glance, it was obvious that Perez was living way too large to be able to afford on a cop's salary. Further investigating of the evidence lockup found that there were other unexplained cocaine disappearances. The February before the 6 pounds went missing, another 2 pounds had gone missing. 2 pounds that had been brought in initially by Officer Liga, the guy who shot Gaines, who was an old friend of Perez's, who Perez may or may not have held a grudge against Liga. This was enough for the cops to serve Perez with a search warrant on August 6, 1998. Inside of his house, they found a bunch of stolen police stuff, scanners, radios, badges, raid jackets, staplers probably. Also inside the house was a box labeled Crash, Secret, Confidential, which was filled with about half a dozen fake but very realistic guns. That's kind of weird, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really weird. Why?
Maybe he's got a hobby.
Maybe he's making a movie.
Yeah, maybe he's finally following his dreams and making that.
He's making the movie Trading Day.
And they changed his name to Anton Fuqua. They then requested his phone records, which showed that he was sometimes making over 100 phone calls a day. The boy likes to talk.
Yeah, he's lonely.
That's the big deal. One name stuck out, Veronica Quesada. You might want to write that down also, who he had called just before and just after the coke was stolen. So the police visited Quesada, who was Perez's mistress and was also on that post-robbery trip to Las Vegas. And found in her house not just a ton of coke, but also a picture of Perez in what they call a 211 suit. 211 being the code for a bank robbery, listen to that episode.
Yeah, I know that now.
And the suit being a nylon running suit, which was a typical outfit for a bank robber. Perez was also throwing out gang signs in the picture. Quesada tipped them off that Perez was selling the drugs through her and had stolen even more coke, and closer inspection showed that there were a total of 11 other instances where officers had switched out evidence cocaine and replaced it with Bisquick. They went for the good stuff. All of these instances seemingly were orchestrated by Perez. There had also been a lot of unexplained deposits into Perez's bank accounts. So finally, this was all too much. On August 25th, they officially arrested Perez. His first words when they came to get him, "Is this about the bank robbery?"
No, but it is now.
We're double arresting you. He was put on trial for possessing coke for the purpose of selling, grand theft, and also forgery. But Perez was so charming and convincing in court that the jury got deadlocked at an 8-4 vote for conviction, but they couldn't come to an agreement, so the jury was declared hung, and they hung them all. And it ended in a mistrial in December 1998. His retrial was scheduled for September 1999, but Perez started thinking that he probably wouldn't get lucky twice. And the DA, who was a Mr. Gil Garcetti, the father of our current mayor. Garcetti was doing a lot of gang work at the time. He also oversaw the O.J. Simpson and the Menendez case. He was putting a lot of pressure on Perez's wife, who was a civilian LAPD employee who they figured knew everything that he had been up to. So they threatened to charge her with not cooperating with the police investigation. Perez wanted his wife and his daughter protected, so he decided to cut a deal. He wanted immunity for his wife and a reduced sentence for himself of 5 years and his own immunity from further prosecution. In return, he'd tell them exactly what was happening at Rampart CRASH.
Oh boy.
The DA agreed on September 8th and the floodgates were open. Perez requested from jail all the Rampart CRASH arrest reports in order to point out which ones were falsified. He reviewed 1,509 cases and pointed out that 91 of them were falsified, 63 involving himself. His confession lasted for 50 hours over the course of 35 sessions spread out over 9 months and produced over 4,000 pages of testimony.
Wow.
Let's first get to what really happened with the third incident that we were talking about. The Ovando thing where Perez and his partner paralyzed the guy and he got 23 years. They had said that Ovando burst in intending to kill them. What really happened was Perez and his partner Durden had gone into their observation apartment and found Ovando was living in there. They handcuffed him and interrogated him as to why he was there. Ovando wasn't cooperating. I guess if it's with cops, you're not cooperating.
Yeah, you're not cooperating.
So they shot him in the chest and then in the neck, and they planted a gun on him before calling an ambulance, hoping he was dead.
Wow.
When this was confessed, Ovando was immediately released from prison and went on to sue the city and won the biggest police misconduct settlement in LA history in 2000. He got $15 million. Planting guns, as Perez confessed, was not an unusual thing in Rampart CRASH. He claimed that every officer in that unit had an extra gun to plant on a gangster if needed at all times. They were known as laydowns or throwdown guns, and they're planted to justify the violence that the officers had used against them. They usually had at least one bullet in the chamber because that was a harsher penalty, and many times they would file off the serial number because that's an automatic felony. They would force gang members to supply them with these guns. Planting guns like this and lying about probable cause to justify their force was the most common thing being done here. Perez said that 90% of CRASH officers in all districts were falsifying information. They were also planting evidence of other kinds on people that they wanted arrested, but in addition to shooting unarmed people and framing them, they would also beat gang members just to intimidate them. They would punch them, kick them, choke them, usually while they were handcuffed. Bones were broken. The worst instance of this involved a member of the 18th Street gang named Ismael Jimenez. His name's not so important.
Call me
Jimenez. He had previously been abused by Rampart CRASH officers and had filed a complaint against it. So in retaliation, on February 26, 1998, he was handcuffed and brought into the Rampart station where he was beaten and choked so bad he started vomiting blood. They then released him into the wild and he made his way to the hospital where the doctors reported the abuse. He was then visited in the hospital by Rampart CRASH officers to intimidate him, but a couple of cops did end up getting fired over this, luckily. One time, Rampart CRASH officers went to a funeral of a gang member, searched all the cars that were there without any legitimate reason. Drugs were found and arrests were made.
Wow.
They one time crashed. You get it?
No.
Me neither. Why did I write it like that? They crashed. Oh, I get it now. A gang party, and they made everyone there line up. Then they picked people at random down the line and made up charges against them.
Oh, cool.
One guy was accused of having a gun, and he pleaded guilty just to avoid a longer sentence. Wow. Once they used a guy as a battering ram and kept ramming his head into a wall.
Is this a Tex Avery cartoon?
Yeah, but a lot funnier. They kept ramming his head into a wall until he told them what they wanted to hear. They would sometimes take a guy, drive him deep into another gang's territory, make him take off his shirt so all his tattoos were showing, kick him out of the car, and then announce on their loudspeaker that a rival gangster was here.
Oh no.
One guy said they did this to him. He got jumped and stabbed by 10 guys. One story was that Perez's mistress was also seeing another guy, and when Perez found out, he raided that guy's house and planted drugs on him, and that guy got 6 years in prison.
Wow.
Some people were dropped out of windows.
Oh my God.
In 1995, there were 3 officer-involved shootings in Rampart CRASH. In 1996, just 1 year later, there were 12. They would celebrate these sorts of things by going drinking at the Short Stop at 1455 Sunset Boulevard, near Greg's house.
I was just there a week ago.
Yeah, and what were you doing before that?
I was planting guns.
What else?
I was throwing people out of windows.
Did they deserve it?
That's for the Lord. That's for the Lord.
That's for Suge Knight to decide. Another place they would party is at one of the many crash pads, which is another one of their fun little puns.
I bet they high-fived every time I said it. Get it?
They had these throughout the city, which were just like ratty apartments where the officers would take their mistresses. They would drink, do drugs, party with hookers, drug dealers, and their informants. In essence, Rampart Crash really was another gang. Perez likened it to a fraternity. Well, that's a gang.
Yeah.
And said that most of the stuff they were doing was approved by their sergeant, Edward Ortiz, and they didn't think anything was wrong with it. He said, these guys don't play by the rules. We don't have to play by the rules. There was the concept of being in the loop, which meant you knew what was happening and you could be trusted not to say anything about it. Those who did not want to be in the loop got dropped out of a window. They got into it, the crash thing. They saw what was going on and they would transfer out, which is why there were so many transfers out of Rampart Crash. As for Perez himself, he says he never saw any sort of crooked behavior before he joined Rampart Crash. According to Perez, the worm turned in May of 1997 when he and Durden arrested a coke dealer and confiscated his drugs and his pager. A little later, the pager rang, so they called the guy and they set up a deal with the intent of arresting this guy when he showed up, and when the time came, they figured, let's just sell it and we'll keep the money.
I got an idea. Let's be criminals when this guy shows up.
These guys make a lot of money.
Imagine being there for that when the guy's talking to them and they just look at each other like, you know, this guy's got a hell of a pitch.
What's the harm? Who's getting harmed in this deal? Oh, children? They did this a couple more times and they ended up making $10,000. So how could you say I would do that? Perez says it was Durden's idea. Durden, of course, says it was Perez's idea. Regardless, this was when Perez claims to have gone bad. Some say he broke bad. Even though some suspect this sort of behavior started even further back in 1992. From this, he moved on to doing all the other things that we already talked about, and Perez didn't feel bad at all about it. He was okay with planting evidence and all that. He said, it felt good. I'm taking this guy off the street. One way or another, he's taking him off the street. Eventually, the power went to his head and said that his job became an intoxicant that I lusted after. Gang members and other people from the community spoke out against Perez as well. One girl said that Perez had once gotten her pregnant and made her get an abortion and then take the bus home from the clinic. Of all the things that happened in the world, that's like the saddest thing. Yeah. He was accused of showing photos of gangsters he didn't like to witnesses and making them positively identify them at crime scenes that they weren't a part of. Wow. He's also accused of assassinating a tax collector from the Mexican mafia in a McDonald's, and his and Durden's name come up also being connected with the death of Notorious B.I.G., and Perez is suspected of being the getaway driver in the Bank of America robbery.
Really?
One gang member said that in a dark alley he'd rather meet Satan than Rafael Perez. Some feel that he was trying to start a drug empire of his own by taking out any opposition and becoming king of Rampart.
Yeah.
Perez's testimony implicated around 70 officers. There was enough evidence to bring 58 of these to trial. Of them, 5 were fired, 8 resigned, and 12 were suspended. Those numbers are a little low.
Yeah.
In 2008, there were still some officers that hadn't even come to trial yet. On March 3rd, 2000, all crash units were disbanded and replaced by special enforcement units. There was no investigation into whether or not any other crash units had been behaving similarly, which, how could they not be? The LAPD made the LAPD Board of Inquiry into the Rampart Area Corruption Incidents, a very catchy title, which made 108 specific recommendations to reform, but it was criticized for not addressing the bigger issues here that allowed for this sort of thing to happen. In response, USC law professor Erwin Chemerinsky released an independent analysis of the LAPD's Board of Inquiry report on the Rampart scandal, another great title, which was more critical and called for fundamental overhauls of the way that the LAPD was run. The Department of Justice threatened to sue the LAPD. That's the big deal. If they didn't consent to federal supervision. So on September 19th, 2000, the LAPD was put under a consent decree by the federal government. So they had to report to the federal government. Over 1,000 cases were reopened and came under review for fear that they were falsified by Rampart CRASH, and over 100 cases were overturned, and then came the lawsuits. The settlement cases were being paid for by taxpayers' money, and people feared that it was going to bankrupt the city. The city itself estimated it would have to pay about $125 million in damages. Perez got sentenced to 5 years in the LA County jail, and he would be able to then serve his parole outside of California for his own safety. At his sentencing, he warned all people planning to get involved in law enforcement to use me as an example of who you will avoid becoming, and that whoever chases monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster himself. The problem with Perez's testimony is, how can we trust the word of somebody who is admitted to having lied successfully in court for years?
Yeah.
He took a polygraph 5 times in his admission, and he failed every single question every single time.
Oh my God.
And experts hired by both the prosecutors and the defendants reviewed the tests, the polygraph test, and determined that they were administered wrong. So I don't know what that's about. There's no explanation. Then do it again. Do it differently.
Yeah.
There's no follow-up. When Perez got his hands on all the case files, he put himself in control of the entire case because he was the one that was giving out the information. People felt that he was confessing just enough to make others look worse than he did and to protect all of his friends.
Yeah.
There were jailhouse informants that were telling how Perez had always wanted to get revenge on the cops that he had old feuds with. This seems to have happened when Perez was asked about an officer named Brian Liddy. Liddy and Perez had joined Rampart CRASH the same day, but Liddy, by all accounts, seemed to have actually been an honest cop. He was also the cop that made the arrest that sparked the Rodney King riot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Perez and Liddy did not like each other, but at first Perez said in his testimony that Liddy was okay. But as the weeks went on, he changed his story and accused Liddy of a lot of things that led to Liddy losing his badge and gun. They stripped him of that in the delivery room while his son was being born.
Oh my God.
And they gave it to his son. Don't be like your father, kid.
Officer Baby reporting to duty.
The police chief at the time, Bernard Parks, believed everything Perez said, but most people outside of the police department were sure that he was not telling the full truth, nothing but the truth, help you God. The problem is that most of the people telling a different story than what Perez was saying are gangsters and admittedly crooked cops. So who can we believe in this? The whole thing exposed a shocking depth to the citywide corruption that was going on, but the real problem was the culture that was surrounding the LAPD and LA's justice system. So starting in the 50s and 60s, the LAPD became very militaristic, very manly, and Perez said that it was this aggressive culture that corrupted him. There was this total like us against them atmosphere about the LAPD, but people who have gone through this know that if you think of that job as war, you will have war. So some of the officers may not have committed any crimes, but were complicit in all of this out of the code of silence, where they wouldn't report wrong behavior of their fellow cops, which made all of this so much easier to get away with. As for the courts, the scandal exposed how years of laws and policies that had passed tipped the justice system in favor of protecting cops and against defendants being able to speak out. So things like the 3 strikes law made it more appealing for people to admit to things they didn't do rather than trying to fight it and risk even more severe punishment, which made it easier for a cop to lie and get away with it, because instead of saying a cop is a liar and getting 10 years, they would just say, okay, I did it, and they just get 5 years. The judicial culture was hostile towards the defense and would believe almost anything that a cop would say. Gang members were always seen as inherently guilty. Defense attorneys who were against a crooked cop were heavily criticized, or they were outright fired. And judges who didn't convict a lot were labeled as soft on crime, and they risked not getting elected for more terms. So it's terrifying to think that like you could be completely trapped by just democracy. Like it's all legal. There was bickering among all the sides in this. A detective named Russell Poole had been suspicious of this stuff for years, and he'd been trying to bring it to light, but his superiors, including Chief of Police Parks, kept him suppressed. Poole had a distinguished career. He had investigated the notorious B.I.G. murder, the murder of Bill Cosby's son. That's not the same murder, by the way. Bill Cosby's son was not notorious B.I.G. He was also on the Liga Gaines case and was the evidence coordinator of the North Hollywood shootout.
Oh, wow.
He noticed that the incidents were not being properly investigated and found all these weird connections between all of these cops. He had written up a 40-page report on the guy who had gotten beaten until he vomited blood. But when he turned it in, they confiscated it and they shortened it to a 2-page report.
Oh, my God.
The LAPD was already in bad shape and they had a terrible image, Rodney King, and they had this Operation Hammer, which they had launched, that had failed miserably and violated a ton of civil liberties. So they just didn't want more controversy. Poole eventually resigned because he couldn't be a part of such an organization. And then on September 26, 2000, he sued the LAPD for not allowing him to tell the truth. Regardless, Chief Parks still took the credit for exposing this scandal.
Oh, great.
The LAPD blamed the DA's office for allowing all this to happen, but the DA's office didn't have all the information because the LAPD wouldn't give it to him. Meanwhile, the media blamed both Chief Parks and Garcetti, while Parks shot back that it was the LA Times and the media that were overblowing this whole thing.
They were not.
It was just a mess, and with so many conflicting stories and finger pointing, and Perez saying nothing about Biggie's murder or the bank robbery and denying knowing either Gaines or Liga, even though Liga says that they worked together in narcotics. You can't help but feel that the whole story was never told. And in the end, nobody was really punished that severely and nothing was resolved. So to complicate things even further, what Rampart CRASH was doing was actually working. Gang activity went way down. In 1990, Rampart had 150 murders. In 1997, there were 33.
Wow.
Most people in the community supported what the cops were doing because it made their neighborhood safer. And once CRASH got disbanded, things got bad again. Wow. The cops that took over after all this, they didn't want to be seen as too aggressive, so they were soft on the gangs, and the gangs came back bolder than ever. In the couple of years after it was disbanded, violent crime went up 9%. Homicide went up 116%. Jesus. So the question here becomes, at what cost do we want our streets to be kept safe?
Yeah.
All of this is the stuff that Christopher Nolan's dreams are made of. Mack is now out of prison. I don't know what he's up to. Chief Parks is now a city council member. The disgraced Sergeant Ortiz, Officer Liddy, and another guy named Harper sued the city in 2005, saying that they were used as scapegoats in this whole thing, and they won $15 million.
Oh, cool.
Liga, the one who said it wasn't a racial incident for shooting Gaines, got fired last year when asked about his confrontation with Gaines, that he would have killed a whole truck of them.
Oh.
Them meaning black people.
Great.
Ovando, the guy got paralyzed and won that big settlement, got arrested 4 months after he won the settlement for selling drugs in Nevada.
Oh my God.
As for the federal consent decree that was meant to last for 5 years, it wasn't lifted until 2013 because the judge who ordered it was not happy with how slow the reforms were going. As for Perez, he was released on parole.
Perez on parole.
I would watch that.
It's the best Broadway show I've ever seen.
On July 24th, 2001, 3 years into his 5-year sentence, only to go on trial yet again in 2002 for the Ovando thing, where he got sentenced to 2 more years. Nowadays, he's going by the name Ray Lopez and just got 3 more years of probation for lying about his name on a driver's license application in June 2005. And that's the Rampart scandal. Nothing learned, nothing settled.
God, that's terrifying. Just committing crimes and getting away with it.
And everyone's a liar.
Yeah, Perez got 5 years for all of that.
Yep.
That's insane to me.
And the heroes in that then got fired for horrible things that are unrelated.